Hello, this is Professor Scott Applegate. Welcome to PSCS 6248, Introduction to Cyber Conflict. This is Unit 8, Lesson 1, Assessing State Involvement in Cyber Attacks. Agenda. In this lesson, we will explore a framework developed by Jason Healey used to assess the possibility of state involvement in a cyber attack. We will discuss the characteristics of both state and non-state involvement, and we will then apply the assessment framework to 3 case studies. Introduction. Attribution in cyber attacks is a difficult problem, and highly technical attribution that meets legal standards may not always be available in a timely manner. Both Healey and Valeriano and Menes remind us in their books that at the international relations level, states may not need highly technical attribution in order to act or respond to a serious cyber attack. As Healey notes, the more strategically significant the conflict, the more similar it is to conflicts in the other domains. Attribution, which usually starts at the most technical level before working up to the people and organizations responsible, may not be a helpful approach for such strategically important cyber conflicts. Valeriano and Menes also note that the attribution problem is often overstated. In international relations, we can know who is the most likely to utilize cyber tactics against whom. While the Internet's infrastructure may be problematic and may need evaluation, building in more identifications is unnecessary. We must move beyond the forensics model of international communications and think more about how interactions usually take place and why. If South Korean television companies are hacked by a coordinated and well-timed piece of malware, it is almost useless, if not counterproductive, to know what country the incident physically came from. Knowing the internet traffic was routed through China does not solve the problem. The source of the incident, North Korea, is obvious. As Healey notes, it may be more useful to take a top-down strategic approach to determine national responsibility in these international interactions. Who had the capability to conduct an attack? Who benefits from an attack? What technical factors support or contradict conclusions of state responsibility? What nation, if any, is responsible? Healey has identified 14 factors that can assist in assessing state responsibility in a cyber attack. We will explore these factors in the next couple slides. Characteristics of non-state involvement. Healey identifies 14 factors to use in the evaluation of a cyber attack. A cyber attack conducted by non-state actors, who are not conducting the attack on behalf of a state, will tend to demonstrate different characteristics than an attack sponsored or conducted by a state. For example, direct commercial benefit is generally an indicator of cyber crime rather than state-sponsored actions. Low technical and targeting sophistication, broad popular angst, and public statements from hackers is generally more indicative of actions by hacktivist groups such as Anonymous, rather than a state action. If an attack has little correlation with a belligerent state's policies or strategic goals, is not correlated or integrated with physical force, and may be beneficial to many other nations or groups, it is difficult to assess such an attack as being the work of one particular state. Characteristics of state involvement. Some characteristics, such as a correlation or integration with physical force, or direct attribution to a state or state organization, obviously points to state involvement. Beyond the obvious, we can look at the characteristics of the attack itself. State-sponsored attacks tend to be highly sophisticated both in terms of targeting and technical capability. Attacks that have a strong correlation with a belligerent state's national policy or with public statements made by national leaders, attacks written or correlated in a national language, and attacks which lack commercial benefit or benefits to other groups or nations are characteristic of state or state-sponsored attacks. Additionally, nations which sponsor attacks are often uncooperative in responding to investigations or pleased to assist in stopping such attacks. Spectrum of state responsibility. This spectrum shows the full range of how nations can be responsible for attacks by ignoring, abetting, or conducting cyber attacks. At levels 1 and 2, the nation will stop the attack if they can. At levels 3 and 4, the nation is ignoring or encouraging the attacks, but is not truly sponsoring them. At levels 5 and 6, the nation is clearly the sponsor, as the group is getting very active support. Above that level, from level 7 to 10, The nation itself is the de facto control over the attack. Any non-states involved are direct proxies under the control of the state, and the attacks are state-sponsored. Too often, technical tools and methodologies are unable to determine where an attack lies on the spectrum. Fortunately, there is a rich tradition of analysis in the technical disciplines, as well as in the law enforcement, intelligence, and legal professions, which can guide us. Case studies. In the following slides, we will apply Healey's assessment framework to 3 case studies and try to determine where the cases lie on the spectrum of state responsibility. We will look at the Estonian and Georgian cyber conflicts along with the Stuxnet attack and evaluate each using Healey's 14 factors. Analyzing the Estonian cyber attacks of 2007. In evaluating the cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, it appears that Russia may have played some role in the attacks. Initially, the majority of the attacks were traced directly to Russia, and some were even traced to Russian state organizations. When Estonia publicly announced this fact, many of the attacks suddenly shifted to servers in other countries. The attacks were coordinated in Russian on Russian-language hacker forums. Russia exercises partial but growing control over its internet, with the state owning much of the infrastructure and even owning the main social media platform used in the country. The technical sophistication of the attacks was relatively low, with hackers providing script kiddie tools to participants on hacker forums, although one could argue the use of crowdsourcing to conduct the attack suggests a subtle sophistication that is in keeping with the Russian character of conducting information operations. Targeting sophistication in the Estonian attacks was moderate, with hackers providing detailed lists of targets on the hacker forums and tracking the status of each target. There was strong popular angst against Estonia, but much of this was generated by the Russian state and state-sponsored groups such as the Nashi. There was little to no financial benefit to the attackers, and there is some evidence that Russia provided support to hackers and groups such as the Russian Business Network. There was a strong correlation between the attacks and statements made by Russian leadership up to and including the Russian president's office. Russia refused to cooperate with any form of investigation into the cyber attacks and did not provide any assistance in stopping or shutting down the attacks. There was a highly perceived benefit to Russia and a strong correlation with Russian national policy. Finally, there was low to moderate correlation with physical violence, as violent protests kicked off in the streets of Tallinn simultaneously with the start of the cyber attacks. This analysis demonstrates that Russia's responsibility is somewhere in the middle of the spectrum of state responsibility. With no evidence of direct assistance or coordination, the attacks were not directly state-sponsored, but clearly, the Russian government is not without responsibility. This assessment suggests Russian responsibility is somewhere between level 3 state ignored and level 6 state coordinated. There is no evidence available supporting any nation providing active assistance to the attack. However, Russia does not escape all responsibility. There were clear statements from the highest levels of Russian government, a lack of cooperation with the investigation, a clear correlation with Russian official policy, and a complete failure of the government to rein in the attacks. There is accordingly high confidence that the attacks on Estonia were at least state-encouraged by the Russian government and were possibly state-shaped, although other than links to the Nashi youth group, there is simply not enough solid evidence to conclude it was state-shaped or state-coordinated. Analyzing the Georgian cyber attacks of 2008. Analyzing the Georgia cyber attacks of 2008, the analysis looks similar to Estonia, though more damning for Russia. Like the Estonian attacks, most of the initial attacks came from inside the Russian Federation, with attacks transitioning abroad as Georgia blocked traffic from Russia. Unlike the Estonian attacks, there was no direct ties to Russian government organizations, which simply might imply a lesson learned on Russia's part. The attacks were coordinated by Russian-language hacker forums and were moderate in sophistication, with evidence of data exfiltration not seen in the Estonian attacks. Russia enjoys partial but growing control of its internet infrastructure. Targeting sophistication was low to moderate, with tracking of targets on hacker forums, but also with some deliberate targeting of military or political systems for exfiltration of data. There was broad public angst against Georgia within the Russian Federation, but much of this is fomented by the Russian government. Russia has shown some state support of hackers. In particular, there are thought to be covert ties between the Russian business network and the Russian government, and there were strong public statements that correlated with the purposes of these attacks. As with the Estonian cyber attacks, Russia refused to cooperate with any investigation, and Russia is the main state that would benefit from the attacks. Finally, there was very strong correlation between the cyber attacks and both the Russian national policy and the use of physical force, with attacks starting just hours before Russia lobbed its first artillery rounds across the border. This assessment places Russia squarely in the middle of the spectrum of state responsibility, somewhere between 4 state-encouraged and 7 state-ordered. There is weighty evidence in several categories that implies the Russian state provided active assistance to the cyber attackers. Thus, the attack was clearly not just encouraged, but directly supported. One analyst, through direct access to the relevant log files and interviews, concluded the attackers were tipped off prior to the start of military operations, and that the primary objective of the cyber campaign was to support the Russian invasion. This applies enough connection with the attackers for the government to suggest targets and timing. However, there seems to be little evidence that the groups involved were under direct orders regarding what to attack and when, so the attacks were likely not state-ordered. Accordingly, the preponderance of the evidence suggests with moderate confidence that the attacks on Georgia were state-shaped or state-coordinated by the Russian government. Analyzing the Stuxnet attacks of 2010. In assessing the Stuxnet attack of 2010, it is fairly clear that it was a state-conducted attack, but may not be clear exactly who conducted the attack. There is some anecdotal evidence that the United States or Israel were involved in the attack, although there is no direct evidence tying the attack to a nation or state organization. The attack tools were written and coordinated in English, but this is not conclusive given that it is the predominant language used in programming and technology. None of the suspected states involved have state control over their internet infrastructures. The bellwether of state involvement in this attack is the very high level of sophistication of the malware. At the time of its discovery, it was the most sophisticated piece of malware ever discovered, suggesting the necessity for state-level resources to develop the tools. Additionally, the targeting sophistication of the malware was also incredibly precise, targeting a very particular set of SCADA devices operating within a specified set of environmental parameters. The results of the Stuxnet attack had a very high correlation with public statements made by both Israel and the United States, and there was little popular angst, financial benefit, or state support to hackers. There was no effort at an international investigation by Iran, so there was no subsequent evaluation possible in terms of state cooperation. The United States and Israel are the most obvious beneficiaries of the Stuxnet attack, since its results correspond with their national policies. The goals of the attack could be seen to have moderate correlation with physical force, as covert operations, purportedly by Israel, have targeted Iranian nuclear scientists for assassination in years leading up to the attack. Additionally, Israel has conducted kinetic strikes against nuclear facilities in Muslim countries in the past. The extremely high sophistication of the tool and the precise and select targeting help rule out the theory that rogue state actors or non-state adversaries were responsible for the Stuxnet attack. The preponderance of evidence suggests with high confidence that this was a state-executed attack, although we can conclude with only moderate confidence that it was executed by the United States or Israel, as there is simply not enough direct evidence to tie either country to the attack, especially given mixed reporting from anonymous sources within the U.S. government. Conclusions. There is often a lack of evidence for direct attribution in cyber attacks. Nation-states have demonstrated a willingness to use non-state actors as proxies for cyber intrusions and cyber attacks. States go to great efforts to cloak their activities in cyberspace to avoid direct attribution. A methodology is needed to evaluate cyber attacks to determine the probability of state responsibility in such attacks. J. Healey has proposed 14 factors to consider in assessing such attacks. While Healey's method does not provide direct legal attribution, it does give researchers a method to circumstantially assign probable responsibility. All of our authors have noted the need for absolute technical attribution is overstated. In international relations, we can know who is most likely to utilize cyber tactics against whom. We can deduce who conducted an attack based on who has the capability and who benefits. International relations does not rely on forensic science, and states often act with incomplete information, especially when it comes to defending themselves. Given this, we must move beyond the forensics model of international communications and think more about how interactions actually take place and why. This is Professor Scott Applegate. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson on assessing state involvement in cyber attacks. Please feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions in regards to this lecture.